It was 1920, and me and my husband were living in a small dirt floor cabin nestled away in the Ozarks. He had returned home from war, and as was the case for many soldiers, had a hard time finding work. We didn't have a pot to pee in, but we had one another. Back then, most people could only muster to do what it took to survive, and that's what we were doing, surviving. We worked for a fellow that had a bunch of land, and in turn for our labor, he gave us a small patch up in the hills to build our cabin on. The property was just large enough for us to have a small garden, raise some chickens, and have a few pigs. That was enough to sustain us for the most part, and my husband would pick up side jobs here and there to make sure we had enough to make it through the slow times. Living in those type conditions and having known no better or no different, I wasn't afraid of much. Being at home by myself didn't bother me a lick, but there was something about that little cabin that every now and then would rattle my nerves. I had told my husband about the strange thumps I'd hear from time to time on the side of the cabin when he was out coon hunting at night, but he always would have an answer. It was just my imagination. It was the wind. It was the wood popping. But I knew better. It weren't no different than any other place I'd lived growing up. I knew all the sounds you hear at night, and this was different. This sounded like someone smacking the side of the wall as hard as they could. I'd run out there with the gun, but I'd never see anybody. Everything would just be real quiet. Not even the tree frogs would be chirping. The only time it seems to happen is when my husband is gone. I reckon I'd think I was crazy too if I were him, but something would happen that would change his mind. Late one night I woke up to my husband sitting up on the side of the bed, just sitting there. I asked what was wrong, and he just held out his hand telling me to be quiet. He was listening at something, so I started listening too. Way off in the distance, sounded like it was at least 2 hollers over, was the most mournful cry you've ever heard. It was like a long drawn-out moan. I thought whatever man is doing that must have the lungs of a bull, but I knew better. It weren't no man, not out here, not making sounds like that. A few minutes later we could hear it again, this time closer than before. Whatever it was moving towards us. Sounded like it was coming down the creek that wrapped around our property. Then, a second one sounded off and nearly jumped me out of my skin. This one was loud and deeper. It sounded like it was just over the top of the hill above our cabin. My husband grabbed his gun and his coon light and headed outside. I yelled for him to stop, but he didn't listen. By the time I got my robe on, he had fired off a shot. He came inside, latching the door behind him. I asked him if he shot whatever it was, but he just shook his head no. He hung his gun back up on the wall, saying that he couldn't see anything, so he just fired a shot into the air to scare the things off, whatever they are. A week or more had gone by, and nothing had happened since that night. We had settled back into our normal routine, and it seemed that whatever it was gone, or so we thought. We were just sitting down at the table for supper one late evening. I remember it clearly as it was storming that night. The rain had really cut loose while I was cooking, but by the time we were sitting down, it had slowed down quite a bit. My husband was saying grace when I heard the awfulest racket coming from outside. It was the sound of our pigs, and they sounded like the devil itself had a hold of them. Well, that's because it did. My husband grabbed the gun by the door, and this time I followed right out after him with the lantern. It took me a second to get it lit, but this time he waited for me. I think we were both a little frightened of what we might find out there in the dark. I stepped out, and we headed down towards the pig pen. It was a little bit away from the cabin, seeing how if you've ever been around a pig pen in your life, you know you want to keep at a distance from where you spend most of your time at. The pigs kept cutting up as we got closer to them. Whatever was out there messing with them was still there. Suddenly, my husband froze in his tracks. I raised the lantern up to see towards the pen, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a big old black bear standing on its hind legs, but there weren't no bears around those parts that got that big, and this thing had big old shoulders like a man. This thing, this mountain devil, had to be at least as tall as our porch roof if it were a foot. I watched as it reached down into the pen with its long arm and just scooped up our best hog as if it were picking up a dog. That hog was close to 300 pounds, and a man wouldn't have been able to reach both of his arms around it if he were hugging it. This monster just picked it up with one arm like it was nothing at all. My husband raised his gun and looked down the barrel. I could see his knuckles turn white as he gripped the stock. I held my breath, waiting for the loud crack, but it never came. After all the shooting he had done in the war, the sight of this creature gave him pause. My husband stood there watching as this thing walked off into the darkness. Now that the moment was over, I realized it had happened so quickly I wanted to pinch myself to see if I was really awake, but I knew I was. My husband didn't say a word. He just lowered the gun and walked back into the house. I raised the lantern up one more time to see if I could see the beast again, but it was long gone. That's when I realized the sound of the pig had stopped as well. I don't know if it was fear or bewilderment that kept my husband from pulling the trigger that night. Maybe it was both, but whatever the reason, I have to honestly say I'm glad he didn't do it. This thing knew we were there and it didn't care. I'm afraid to think what might have happened had he taken a shot at it. It wasn't long after that my husband found full-time work and we moved on into town. We put that little dirt floor cabin and the events of that night behind us. But every time I hear the sound of a pig squealing, a chill runs down my spine.